Appreciate everyone. Well, I want to be sure and I hope to remind you once before we leave, but we have Holly's birthday was Thursday, the 9th. Kim's birthday is what is it, Kim?
Wednesday.
It is
Tomorrow.
Wednesday. Kim's birthday is Wednesday,
Next day.
and we want to be sure and sing happy birthday to them before we go.
Stuart,
Uh-huh.
when we talked the other day, we decided, or thought it might be a good idea to say we love you instead of try to name all of them.
When we're singing happy birthday, instead of trying to name everybody, which sometimes we get a little, just say happy birthday, we love you, instead of trying to name everybody. I also want everybody to notice that there's one Eagles fan in here today.
Yay!
What, Kim doesn't get to stay.
Thank you, Jace.
We don't have that much time. No, we're glad you're here, Jace. We're glad you're here. I got to tell you that we're in the courthouse there in Clarendon. And one person that was also an Eagles fan. She's a big Eagles fan. So we had some cookies, and we put on the cookies, Mahomes for president. So we went with that. All right. You know, we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each one has a little different focus. It may be who they're directed to. You know, Matthew may have a little more of a Jewish focus, to kind of targeting towards Jewish people. You look at Mark, and it certainly would fit for a wide variety, but it may have a little more Gentile focus. Luke is certainly written to one individual based on research, as opposed to his own eyewitness account. It's based on the research that he's done, writing to the most excellent Theophilus. So you have just a little bit different. And then John is different than all 4 of the other 3. And one of the things we see in John is he presents Jesus over and over through conversation. There's lots of conversations in the book of John. And it may be with Mary and Martha at their home. It might be with his disciples on the road. And of course, there's all those conversations with the scribes, the Pharisees, and the lawyers, where they try to trick him, and it doesn't ever work. But all the time we have conversations. And when we see those conversations in John, I think it's important to realize how important conversations are. Because we don't always see Jesus in the synagogues. We know it tells us that he did preach in the synagogues. We know he preached on the side of the mountain, on the Sermon on the Mount. But usually what we see is just a one-on-one encounter with Jesus and an individual. And he teaches through that. And John reveals Christ to us through the way that he shows those conversations. And one of the things I want us to realize is how important those conversations are. As we're looking at conversations in the book of John, one of the things it tells us, if we count up the conversation verses, the longest conversation he has is with a Samaritan woman. And I didn't realize that until this week. I was looking at it. But that's the longest conversation he has throughout. Because usually somebody will ask Jesus something and he'll answer a question that they don't understand, and then it just kind of goes from there. Or maybe he kind of shuts them down. But we have this long conversation in there. And if that's the longest conversation Jesus has, I think it's worth looking at. I know we've looked at it before, but we're going to look at it again. You know, Buddy Bobbitt, and I know a lot of you know him, some of you don't. He's dead now, but I always liked to listen to Buddy. And he would tell me that there is no word in the Bible that is not significant. Everything in there is significant. And he says, I don't always understand. I appreciated Terry's prayer that sometimes we don't know. And Buddy would freely admit, I may not understand, but the more time I spend on it, the more I know, the more I understand. And he says, I am convinced there is not one unimportant word in there. And I think he's right. But also we want to look at sometimes when we look at just a single passage and we just really dive down into that passage, we can learn a lot about that. And that's good. But sometimes we miss the bigger picture because we concentrate just on that little bit. And sometimes I think it's important that we look at a broad picture, so that we can get a little different. And sometimes we need to look at what things are next to it. And if we look at the story in chapter 3, we see this conversation that Jesus has with Nicodemus. And then in chapter 4, we see this conversation that Jesus has with the Samaritan woman. And I think what we're going to try to do today is look at those two conversations that Jesus has, and see if we can learn something by how they go together. And because that's quite a bit of reading, we're not going to try to read all of that. I encourage you to read John 3 and John 4. It's certainly worthwhile. But we see there that they are connected. That when we look at them together, there's a lot of verses that really kind of explain each other. And first we're going to kind of look at Nicodemus. If I guess we can do it that way. Yeah, okay. And we see that Nicodemus came, and he is a Jewish leader. He's a teacher of the law. They give him a name. And one of the things when you look at the Bible, there's a lot of nameless characters in there. But Nicodemus is named. And he comes at night to talk to Jesus. And I think that's something that a lot of times we think he comes at night just because he didn't want anybody to see him, and that may be part of it. But in John, darkness and light, all the way through the book, starting there in chapter 1, Jesus is the light that came into the world. And it goes all the way through the book. Darkness and night. That Jesus is the light as opposed to the night. And Nicodemus comes to him. This man, if you were talking about a good member of the community, whatever you're talking about, the leader of the Rotary Club or whatever it is, that would be Nicodemus. He is a religious guy. He knows the law. He's a teacher. He's a man. And he comes. And we see that. And when he comes, Jesus tells him, the wind blows where it wishes, and you hear it sound, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. Now, when Nicodemus comes, I know that sometimes we kind of give him a little bit of a bad reputation maybe, because we think about him that he comes at night, and he leaves at night. He leaves in the dark. But he comes seeking Jesus. Let's not forget that. That he comes and he says, we know that you are from God. And he wants to talk to him. He wants to learn. Now he doesn't understand when Jesus tells him, you must be born again. Nicodemus looks at that as the literal statement. That you must be born again. And he says, how can we re-enter our mother's womb? And Jesus says, you don't understand much. And he continues. And then he gives him this one. That the Spirit, everyone who is born of the Spirit. And then old Nicodemus says, how can these things be? And he leaves at night. And so he comes at night to talk to Jesus, and he leaves at night. But it's not just the daylight and dark that we're talking about. It's his mind. He comes, he doesn't know. And when he leaves, he asks, how can these things be? That he still does not understand. So his understanding is also darkened when we look at this. Now I want to point out, I like Nicodemus. I like Nicodemus because we see him here. He's in the dark. He came to seek Jesus. He doesn't understand, but he keeps going. As we see later on in John, he argues for Jesus in front of the Sanhedrin. And then when Jesus is killed on the cross, it is Nicodemus that takes him down and helps to bury him. So we see Nicodemus grows in his faith. He grows all the way through the book of John. And I like that because I think that in some ways we're all like that. That we don't always get everything right away. That it takes time. That we have to grow into this. And so I don't want to knock him down. But I do think that we want to compare him to the Samaritan woman. And at the beginning of John chapter 4, it says that Jesus is going from Judea to Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. Now, if you look at a map, you can see there that actually he doesn't have to go through Samaria. He can go to Judea, and then here's Samaria here, and Galilee's here. But many people one of the accepted routes, and probably the easier route, was to cross the Jordan and then go north and across to Galilee instead of going straight through. But he goes through Samaria. And I think we can even tell it. And he goes up here to Sychar, which is in southern Samaria, right there as he crosses the border, which is where Jacob's well is. That's where Jacob, back in the Old Testament, I thought I had a picture, but maybe I don't. That's all right. That's all right. Is in a valley, Sychar, Jacob's well, where Jacob's well is. In the Old Testament, it would be the community of Shechem. And here it's Sychar in the New Testament. And it's changed name now. And today it's called Nablus. And but it's between two mountains, which when we say mountains, they're really not what we consider mountains, but they're hills. And in Sychar, Shechem, or Nablus, where the well is in the valley between these two mountains. Mount Gerizim and Mount two mountains, I'm sorry. I can't think of the other mountain. Gerizim is where the Samaritan temple was. But he goes up here, and when he goes through, he stops at Sychar, at the well, which is just outside of town. And he is tired. The Bible tells us that he is tired. And this woman shows up at noon, in a bright day, as opposed to Nicodemus, who comes at night. The Samaritan woman comes in the day, when it's light, when people can understand. And Jesus speaks to her and says, "Give me a drink." Now, when he speaks to her, that's not what people do. We're going to do a little comparison here between the two of them. Then we have a Jewish man, Nicodemus, who is named. The Samaritan woman, she's not named. She's not a leader, as Nicodemus is. She's kind of marginalized. There's no indication that she's educated. I shouldn't say that. I don't know. But certainly not mentioned. She comes at noon in the light, as opposed to Nicodemus, who comes at night and leaves in the darkness of his understanding. But she's going to leave enlightened. Nicodemus asks questions, but does not understand the answers. On the other hand, the Samaritan woman asks questions. She engages in conversation with Jesus, and then she's going to go and tell others. But when Jesus says to her, "Give me a drink," her response is, the Samaritan woman, taking aback, asks, "How come you, a Jew, are asking me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" Jews in those days wouldn't be caught dead talking to Samaritans. Now that's the Eugene Peterson, the Message translation, but I just like the way he phrased that. So I chose to use this one. Samaritans and Jews didn't get along. It's not just that Jews looked down on Samaritans, but Samaritans didn't like the Jews either. It's a mutual thing. They argued all the time about where were you supposed to worship. Are you supposed to worship in Jerusalem, at the temple in Jerusalem, which the Jews would say? Or are you supposed to worship on Mount Gerizim, when there was a temple on Mount Gerizim that the Samaritans had built? And they would argue all the time about where you're supposed to worship. And when I think of that, I think of us today. Do we get in religious arguments today that make about as much sense as where? Which building are you going to go to? Or are you going to worship God? And as we see that one of the things Jesus tells her, it's not about where you go. It's about worshiping God in spirit and in truth. That's what's important. But she's talking to him here. And about 100 years before this, when Judea was an independent country, the leader of the Jews, a guy called John Hyrcanus, he was their king at that time. He goes north into Samaria, goes up on Mount Gerizim and destroys the temple. And he killed a bunch of people when he did it. So the Samaritans and the Jews have a lot of animosity. It's not like we're saying, I'm for the Chiefs instead of the Eagles. It's not like that kind of thing. It's much more serious that they kill each other at times. Not all the time. They sometimes could coexist. But there is enemy between them. And she says, how can you, a Jew, a man, be talking to me, a woman? And that's one of the things that we have, and Jesus responds to her. And one of the things he tells her, if you knew the gift of God, and who it is that is saying to you, "Give me a drink," you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. That if you knew the gift of God, and who it is that's talking to you, if you knew who I am, you'd be asking me for living water. You know, when we look at the book of John, we see over and over, one of the questions that we have, who is this guy Jesus? Who is Jesus? And here it is, he's saying, I would give you living water. And of course, that's what she wants. She says, I want living water. I want this water so I won't have to come back here and drink it every day, and get it every day. But one of the things that Jesus tells her, that I am living water, that I have this living water. And that goes right back to the Old Testament. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can know no water. That here is God through the prophet Jeremiah is telling us that God is the fountain of living waters. And here is Jesus telling this Samaritan woman, I am responsible for living waters. It is a direct claim to divinity. And as we go through this conversation, he tells her everything about her. He tells her how many husbands she's had, who she's living with. He knows everything about her, and she's impressed by that. It makes an impression upon her. And she said, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Because he's told her everything about her. And what does she do? And I find this so interesting. That here we have this woman, and when she sees that he is a prophet, that he can tell her everything about her, she says, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say, that in Jerusalem is a place where people ought to worship. She goes immediately to the biggest religious controversy in the world in that time, between those people. This is the big question. She perceives this guy as a prophet, and she immediately goes and asks him the big question. I like that. Is that when she had a problem, she had a religious question, she has something she doesn't know, she asked the prophet. I don't think she quite understands yet that he is Jesus, because she hadn't said that yet. But she knows this guy knows, so she asks. And I think that there is a lesson to be learned there. That when we don't know, and I'm right there with Terry in his prayer, I don't know all the time, I do not. Go to Jesus and ask. Seek the Lord. Seek the answers from the Lord. And Jesus tells her it's not where you worship is important. It's not. It's that you worship God in spirit and in truth. And she also says, I know that when the Messiah comes, that he'll answer all these questions. And Jesus tells her, that is me. That is me. And what does she do at that point? That she has had this conversation, a long conversation with Jesus. And he has told her that he is the fountain of living waters, that they come from him, that she perceives that he is a prophet. He answers her questions, her religious questions. And it tells us that she left her water jar and went away into town and said to the people, come, see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ? They went out of the town and were coming to him. Is that when she perceived that this was the Christ, when she got that answer to her question, she goes and tells others. And they listen to her and come to Jesus. And I don't think we can get a better example than that. Will led the singing about the harvest this morning. I thought, man, it's like we kind of talked about it. Because that's what we have here. That she's sowing the seed. That she is participating in Christ's mission here on earth. That she takes the word and she goes and she tells others. As we go through the rest of this chapter, we see that the townspeople, the townsmen, come to Jesus and ask him and talk to him. And they said, we believed originally because of you, but now we've talked to him and we believe because we've talked to him. But she took that message, she sowed the seed, and she participated in Christ's mission here on earth. And when we look at this story, when we look at Nicodemus, he left in the dark. This lady left in the light. And she spoke. And she went and spread the word and sowed the seed. And I think we have a lesson there to learn. One of the lessons that I want us to remember is let's not look down on casual conversations. Jesus is out here and he's just wanting a drink, and this lady comes up and a conversation ensues. His life is interrupted, and he interrupts her life and says, get me some water. Now, I'm not saying that we're always going to be around the well. I'm not. But there are times that we will have an opportunity to speak to somebody. And it's a disruption to our lives sometimes. And I will freely admit, that's one of my weaknesses, is I have a schedule and I try to stick with it. I try to be there. And so sometimes when things disrupt my life, I don't take time to just sit down and talk with people. And that's one thing that we see here from Jesus that he did, is that he took a time to have a conversation with one individual. It's not always about preaching to a crowd. It's a lot of times speaking with one individual about Christ, about what we have. But we can also learn from this woman, is she engaged in a conversation, she engaged in a religious conversation, she asks good questions, and she listens. And then she takes the word and goes on. But I think if we look at that, just the idea of her listening to Christ is a good lesson. That when she had a question, she went to Jesus. When Nicodemus had a question, he went to Jesus. Now, he doesn't understand it all, but he went to Jesus seeking answers. And she listens, and she learns, and then she takes it on. And she makes a difference in her world. And if we were going to take something, let's just imagine, what is the difference that she made in that little community? Sorry, I say little community, I have no idea how big it is, now or then. But she made a difference in her community by listening and taking it and spreading the word and participating in Christ's mission. And let's imagine the difference that we can make. That when we look around in our world, can we make a difference in our world? Can we participate in Christ's mission here on earth today, just as this woman did then, and make a difference in our community? And I'm telling you, we can. And I'm not saying I do all the time. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying we can. We can do it together if we just listen to the Lord and take the Lord to other people to make a difference. Because he's going to make the difference. Not us. It's going to be Christ every time that will make the difference. And I encourage you that if you want a difference, we want to help you make a difference. We want to do it together. And if you need something, we want to help you with that. Because helping one another is one way we grow into Christ. But at this time, if you have any need, if you would come while we stand and as we sing.